He bought this ruined cabin to be the tomb of his past, but it would become the cradle of a legend that would leave the entire world in shock. The power to transform a tomb into a cradle is something that deeply inspires us. If this story has already touched you, leave your support in the comments and subscribe to witness the birth of a legend. The sun of the Chihuahuan desert was an incandescent anvil, forging the air into a wave of heat that distorted the landscape. Before the cabin, patched, with clay and hope, Tahay stood motionless, a dark silhouette against the dusty earth. His bare feet felt the cracked ground that he himself had learned to nurture, and behind him a small, green miracle sprouted, defying the aridity. In front of him, a line of men on horseback, rifles resting on their saddles and contempt etched onto their sunburnt faces. Their leader, Don Mateo, his wide-brimmed hat, shadowing a gaze of pure greed, pointed a finger at the well from which life now gushed. That well was an open wound to his pride, and the presence of Tahay, an Apache warrior living on lands he coveted, was an insult he could no longer tolerate. The silence was heavy, filled only by the nervous snorting of the horses and the lonely buzz of a fly. Tahay offered no words, no gestures of surrender or defiance. His eyes, which once sought only the end, now reflected the tenacity of a solitary cactus. He had come to this place to surrender to the ghosts of his slaughtered clan, to let loneliness and hunger do what the bullets could not. But now, the smell of damp earth and the sound of an orphan boy's laughter echoed in his soul. Behind him, his horse, his only companion on the long journey to oblivion, neighed softly, sensing the tension that gathered like storm clouds on the horizon. Don Mateo spat on the ground, the harsh sound breaking the spell. He didn't see a man there, but an obstacle, a savage who needed to be removed. For Tahay, however, that piece of land was no longer a tomb. It was a sanctuary, and he would become the wall to protect it, even if it meant finally finding the death he had once so greatly desired. But to understand how we reached this point, we need to go back in time. Months earlier, there was no defiance in Tahay's eyes, only the dull reflection of dust and resignation. He was a man haunted by memory, a ghost riding towards oblivion. The slow trot of Kia, his horse, its coat stained with sweat and exhaustion, was the only rhythm that marked the passing of days. When his eyes fell upon the wooden skeleton of the cabin, he didn't see a shelter, but a fitting tomb. The walls, devoured by the sun, and the roof, which was more hole than cover, seemed a mirror of his own devastated soul. He dismounted, feeling his bones ache, and said nothing to Kia. The horse, however, rested its muzzle on his shoulder, a gesture of complicity that transcended the need for words. There, in that nothingness, Tahay's journey to die would begin. The first days were a silent dialogue with death. Tahay shared his little water with Kia and fed on bitter roots that the earth offered reluctantly. He didn't fix the cabin, didn't hunt. He just existed, waiting for the sun or hunger to finally claim him. It was Kia's loyalty that woke him from his lethargy. The horse, growing weaker, one day refused to drink the last portion of water, pushing the canteen back towards Tahay with its muzzle. In that gesture, Tahay saw not just an animal, but the last vestige of his clan, a spirit that refused to surrender. That night, for the first time in a long time, he looked at the stars not as witnesses to his end, but as guides, and he remembered his grandparents' teachings on how to read the earth. Life would not be handed to him. It had to be torn from that parched ground, starting with a single drop of water. His search began at dawn, not with a shovel, but with his eyes. He scanned the land, reading the gentle undulations, the almost invisible lines where the withered vegetation clung with a little more stubbornness. He remembered how his grandfather had taught him that water leaves whispers on the surface for those who know how to listen. He found a place, a subtle depression at the foot of a rock formation, and began to dig with his bare hands and a sharpened piece of wood. For days, the only reward was dust and stones. The sun punished his back, his muscles screamed, but he dug, driven by a reborn stubbornness. Kia watched, a silent guardian, and then it came. First, the feeling of cool, damp earth under his broken nails, then a pasty darkness. He waited, and like a fulfilled promise, the first drop of water emerged, a tear from the earth. He dug deeper, and the tear became a trickle, the trickle became a puddle, and the puddle became the beating heart of that place. The water changed everything. It was no longer a place to die, but a place to live. With his thirst quenched and strength renewed, turned his attention to the cabin. He no longer saw it as a tomb, but as a body to be healed. Using the technique of his ancestors, he mixed clay, water, and dry grass, creating a resistant adobe that he patiently applied over the wounds in the wood. Every sealed crack, every reinforced wall was an act of defiance against the despair that had almost consumed him. It was during this work, with his hands covered in mud and his heart strangely light, that he saw him, a small, frightened shadow, watching him from a distance. A boy, no more than 7 years old, thin as a dry branch and with the eyes of someone who had already seen the end of the world. He didn't run when Tahay approached slowly, offering a canteen. The boy drank with the greed of a wild animal, and it was the first time in months that Tahay felt something beyond his own emptiness. He had built a well and a wall, but in taking in that orphan boy, he began to build a home. The boy, whom Tahay came to call Elias, did not speak. His silence was a fortress, built with bricks of fear and loss, but his eyes watched everything. He watched how Tahay moved, with an economy of gestures that spoke of a lifetime in harmony with the land. He watched the gentleness with which he treated Kia and the patience with which he molded the adobe. Slowly, the fortress began to crumble. First, it was a small gesture. Elias held out a handful of dry grass for the mud mixture. Then he started carrying small stones to line the path to the well. One afternoon, while watching Tahay braid a rope from yucca fiber, a fragile sound escaped his lips. Not a word, but a melody, a whistle that imitated the song of a desert bird. In that sound, Tahay heard more than in 1,000 words. The work ceased to be a solitary penance and became a dance for two, a mutual reconstruction where one taught how to survive and the other how to smile. With 2 pairs of hands working, the small refuge flourished in a way that defied the desert's logic. The well water, once used only for drinking, was guided through shallow, ingenious channels lined with smooth stones to irrigate a small garden. There, following ancestral knowledge, they planted the 3 sisters, corn, which offered a stalk for the beans to climb, beans, which fixed nitrogen in the soil to feed the others, and squash, whose broad leaves created shade that retained moisture and prevented weed growth. The cabin was expanded with a new room and a small corral for Kia, built with intertwined branches and adobe plaster. For the few travelers who strayed from their roots, that place was a mirage, an impossible oasis. The news began to spread through distant villages like a whisper on the wind. The story of an Apache and a boy who not only tamed the desert but made it bloom. It was a miracle, some said. For others, like Don Mateo, it was an anomaly. And anomalies, in his lands, needed to be eradicated. This unlikely alliance that made the desert bloom is the true soul of this journey. Leave a comment in support of Tahay and Elias, and subscribe to find out if this little miracle will survive the approaching storm. The whisper of the miracle reached Don Mateo's ears not as a legend, but as an offense. Brought by one of his cowboys, the report of an inexhaustible well on land he considered his, dug by an Indian, was a thorn in his pride. Water was power in that desert, and he was the only one who should wield it. At first, he didn't believe it, but greed overcame skepticism. He didn't go personally. A man of his position did not lower himself to speak with savages. Instead, he sent his foreman, a man with a heart as dry as the land, carrying not an army, but a poisoned offer, a small bag of coins and an order to disappear. The foreman found Tahay and Elias reinforcing the small corral. He threw the bag on the ground, and the sound of metal against the dust was a profanity in the peaceful silence of the place. Tahay didn't move, his calm, deep eyes fixed on the foreman's, ignoring the glint of the coins. Behind him, Elias clutched his shirt, his small body trembling. Without a word, Tahay simply shook his head, a slow, definitive gesture. That piece of land was priceless, for it had been bought with despair and rebuilt with hope. The silent refusal was more insulting to the foreman than any shout of defiance. He spat, mounted his horse, and left, taking the news of the affront with him. When Don Mateo heard, the veneer of his patience shattered. Generosity had been scorned, his authority questioned. "Gather the men," he snarled at the foreman, his eyes glinting with a dark fury. "No savage will claim what is mine. We're going to wipe that place off the map." And so, under the morning sun, they rode, a pack of vultures of steel and fury, ready to dismantle Tahay's little miracle. The heavy sound of Don Mateo's boots breaking the sacred ground of Tahay's sanctuary was the first act of desecration. He dismounted with deliberate slowness, handing the reins to one of his men without taking his eyes off the Apache. He walked to the edge of the well, the epicenter of his fury, and looked into the dark, clear water, as if looking into the face of an enemy. He crouched, dipped his hand in, and lifted it, letting the precious streams of water trickle through his fingers back into the dust. "Fine water," he said, his voice a low growl full of contempt. "It's a shame it's on land that doesn't belong to you." He turned to Tahay, a cruel smile forming on his lips. "You have one last chance, Indian. Take the boy and disappear, or I'll water this garden of yours with your blood." Behind the half-open cabin door, Elias watched, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. Tahay remained silent, but his entire body was a response. Every muscle was tense, a coiled spring ready to leap. His eyes conveyed no fear, only a cold, ancient determination. The Apache's stillness seemed to further ignite Don Mateo's impatience. With a nod, he gave the order. One of his cowboys, a burly man with a sadistic grin, dismounted and drew a machete. He moved not towards Tahay, but to the garden, the green heart of that miracle. With a mocking laugh, he raised the blade to cut down the tallest stalk of corn, the pillar of the three sisters. But the blade never fell. In a blur of restrained motion, Tahay lunged to the side, grabbing a short-handled hoe he used for loosening the soil. The steel of the machete and the sun-hardened wood met with a sharp crack that echoed across the desert. The cowboy recoiled, surprised by the Apache's speed, and in Tahay's eyes, Don Mateo saw the spark that would ignite the prairie. The spark turned into a fire. The humiliated cowboy roared and charged again, swinging the machete in a wild arc. Tahay didn't retreat. He pivoted on his heels, the hoe moving with him, not to block, but to dance with the attack. The moment the blade sliced through the empty air where he had been, the handle of the hoe came down, not with brute force, but with precision, hooking the attacker's ankle. A sharp tug, and the burly man collapsed in the dust, the machete flying from his hand. The fall wasn't what shocked the other men, but the ease, the economy of movement that turned a farming tool into a weapon of disarmament. Don Mateo was no longer smiling. "Useless!" he yelled at the man on the ground. "Get him! I want his head on a stake!" Two other men drew their weapons and advanced, surrounding him. The open space around the well had become a deadly trap. With a swift movement, Tahay fell back, not in flight, but in a tactical retreat, jumping over one of the irrigation channels he had dug himself. The damp earth and smooth stones, once a symbol of life, became an obstacle for his pursuers. He moved towards the cabin, his bare feet finding sure footing where the cowboy's boots slipped. "Elias, inside, now!" he yelled, his voice firm, a command that cut through the tense air. From the crack in the door, a pair of terrified eyes disappeared, followed by the sound of a wooden lock sliding into place. Tahay now had his back to the adobe wall he had built with his own hands, the entrance to his home and the life of a boy behind him. He had nowhere to run, he only had a place to fight. The two men split up, trying to flank Tahay against the adobe wall. The first, more impetuous, rushed forward with a knife, the metal glinting in the sun. Tahay didn't wait. He stepped to the side, not back, and twisted his body using the attacker's momentum against him. The end of the hoe, once a tool for the earth, became an extension of his arm. With a sharp, precise blow, he drove it into the side of the man's knee, who collapsed with a cry of pain and surprise, the knife rolling in the dust. The second man, more cautious, raised a pistol, seeking a clear shot. In that instant, Tahay stamped his foot hard on the dry ground, raising a thick cloud of red dust that obscured the air between them. The shot that followed was a blind crack, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the cabin's mud wall, inches from where his head had been. Through the curtain of dust, Tahay moved like a ghost. Before the gunman could clear his eyes or aim again, he was on him. His hand grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it with a force that cracked bones and sent the weapon falling to the ground with a dull thud. A quick blow with the base of his palm to the man's throat sent him staggering back, gasping for air. In seconds, the coordinated attack had dissolved into a scene of fallen, humiliated men. The silence that followed was heavier than the previous threat. The other cowboys remained mounted, their eyes wide, their confidence shaken. Don Mateo, whose face was a mask of disbelief, slowly saw his contempt morph into a cold, personal hatred. He was no longer annoyed by an obstacle. He was being challenged by an equal. With terrifying calm, he drew his own revolver, an ornate weapon with an ivory handle, and cocked it. The sharp, metallic click cut through the silence. He didn't aim at the men on the ground. He aimed directly at Tahay's heart. The world seemed to shrink, focusing only on the distance between the gun barrel and Tahay's chest. Time stretched, each heartbeat a thunderclap in the silence. Don Mateo savored the moment, the power to give or take life contained in the pressure of his finger. But he wasn't the only living being there, consumed by tension. From the small corral, Kia watched. Its ears pricked forward, the muscles of its hindquarters tensed. The horse, which had shared hunger, thirst, and resurrection with its master, sensed the murderous intent in the air. With a sharp whinny that tore through the quiet, Kia reared up and slammed its front hooves against the fragile branch fence. The dry wood cracked and splintered. The distraction was all Tahay needed. The instant Don Mateo's eyes flickered towards the sound of destruction, Tahay exploded into motion, not forward but sideways, diving and rolling in the dust to break the line of fire. The shot rang out, a thunderclap that sent birds fleeing in panic. The bullet buried itself in the adobe wall, inches from the door behind which Elias cowered. Before Don Mateo could aim again, Tahay was already on his feet, closing the distance under the gun's aim. The fight that followed was not a dance, but a brutal collision. Muscle against muscle, Mateo's desperate fury against Tahay's contained strength. Tahay's hand closed over Mateo's wrist, while the other grabbed the hot barrel of the revolver, pushing it skyward. For a moment, the two men were locked in a stalemate, faces inches apart, the hatred of one burning against the icy determination of the other. With a violent twist, using Mateo's weight against him, Tahay wrenched the gun from his hand. The metallic click of the revolver passing into his possession sounded louder than the shot. Silence fell. Again, but now the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. It was Tahay who held life and death in his hands, and Don Mateo's eyes, now unarmed, burned with a humiliation that promised an even bloodier reckoning. The weight of Don Mateo's gun in Tahay's hand felt foreign, a cold, deadly piece of metal that didn't belong in that place of life. He did not point it at the defeated man. Instead, with a deliberate motion, he opened the cylinder, letting the unfired bullets fall into the dust, small brass. Teeth useless against the earth he nurtured. He then extended the empty revolver back to Don Mateo, handle first. The gesture was deeper than any insult. It wasn't forgiveness, but a statement. Your weapon, your power, was irrelevant here. Don Mateo snatched the revolver from Tahay's hand, his face contorted in a mask of impotent fury. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. He turned, mounted his horse without a backward glance, and with a guttural cry, led his men in a humiliating retreat, taking with them the wounded and a promise of vengeance that hung in the air like the smell of gunpowder. When the sound of hooves disappeared over the horizon, the silence that descended was not of peace, but of aftermath. The dust settled, revealing the disarray, the trampled corn, the broken corral fence, Mateo's men rising with difficulty, limping away. Tahay stood for a long moment, the hoe still loose in one hand, his body aching, but his soul heavy. The sound of the wooden lock being drawn back from the door made him turn. Elias stepped slowly out of the cabin, his large eyes scanning the scene of destruction before settling on Tahay. There were no tears on his face, but a reverent admiration that transcended fear. He approached and, without a word, his small hand found Tahay's, his fingers closing over the calluses of the man who had defended him. Tahay looked at the boy, then at the desecrated land, and finally at the distant horizon where his enemies had vanished. He had won the battle, but he knew with a cold certainty that he had not protected his sanctuary. He had only transformed it into a fortress that would now need to be defended to the end. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed to mock the brutality of the afternoon. The repair work began not with words, but as a silent ritual. Together they raised the trampled cornstalks, tying them gently as if tending to broken bones. They reinforced Kia's corral, not just with branches, but by weaving in yucca fibers to make it stronger, more resilient. It was during this work that Elias's small hand stopped moving. Among the clods of earth, he found the small brass cylinder of the bullet that had missed its target, an alien and obscene object in that sacred soil. He picked it up and held it out to Tahay. Tahay took the casing, feeling its residual warmth. In the man's eyes, the boy saw no anger or fear, but a resolution as cold as stone. Tahay closed his hand over the object and, without a word, pocketed it. It was a reminder. That night brought no rest, but a transformation. While Elias slept a fitful sleep inside the cabin, Tahay became a shadow moving under the stars. The farmer who read the earth for water gave way to the warrior who read it for advantages. He walked the perimeter of his small world, mapping every shadow, every rock, every ripple in the terrain that could offer cover or create a trap. The irrigation channels were no longer just veins of life, they were trenches. The rock formation where he had found water was no longer a landmark, it was an observation post. He began to teach Elias to read the land in a new way, to distinguish the sound of a coyote from the stealthy step of a man, to notice a broken branch, not broken by the wind. The sanctuary was no longer a place of innocent peace, it had become a defended territory, and its tranquility now was the silence of a constant vigil. Humiliation burned. In Don Mateo, hotter than the midday sun. At his ranch, surrounded by riches that now seemed hollow, he obsessively cleaned his ivory-handled revolver as if he could polish the stain on his honor. The memory of the cold metal in his own hand, handed back by one he considered inferior, was a poison in his veins. His men, once loud and arrogant, now moved in silence, casting furtive glances, respect replaced by a shadow of doubt. Mateo realized that a direct attack would not work against a man who seemed to be an extension of the land itself. Brute force had failed. He needed something more primitive, more definitive. Fire. He looked out the window at the horizon, where the sun was setting, and a dark idea took shape. He wouldn't just take the land, he would purify it. He would wait for the cover of night, when the shadows were long and the defenders were tired. He wouldn't send his men to fight, but to set fires, to turn the green oasis into an inferno of ash and smoke. While Mateo's revenge fermented, life in the small refuge transformed. The constant vigil became the new rhythm of their days. Tahay, with Elias's help, began to weave a web of defense, as ingenious as the irrigation he had created. They dug shallow pits, hidden under a thin layer of dust and branches, along the less visible paths leading to the cabin. In the narrowest passages, they planted thorny cactus seedlings, creating natural barriers that would tear the flesh of anyone trying to pass in a hurry. Using yucca fiber, they created discreet tripwires tied to loose stones at strategic points, designed not to trap, but to create noise and imbalance in the darkness. Elias, small and agile, was perfect for squeezing through natural rock tunnels, establishing observation points and hiding jugs of water and stones, turning a boy's playground into a sentinel's fortress. They weren't building walls to hide behind, but shaping the landscape itself into a silent weapon, a living trap that patiently awaited. The enemy's footsteps. The night came moonless, a black velvet cloak dotted with cold stars. Tahay did not sleep. He sat outside the cabin, a silhouette merged with the darkness, listening to the desert's breath. Kia was the first to alert him. A low snort, ears swiveling nervously to the east. Then Tahay felt it too. Not a sound, but an absence of sound, the sudden silence of the crickets, a wrong vibration in the earth. And soon after, a gust of wind brought a strange, acrid smell. Torch, smoke, and horse sweat. He stood up without a sound, touched the shoulder of Elias, who was sleeping near the door, and whispered a single word they had practiced. Now. The boy didn't hesitate, grabbing a water jug and slipping to the observation post in the rocks, disappearing like a small desert spirit. The arrogance of Mateo's men was their first enemy. They moved in a fan formation, torches held high, expecting to find their targets asleep. The first cry was muffled and sudden, as one of the men vanished from sight, falling into one of Tahay's hidden pits. Seconds later, the clatter of cascading stones sounded to the left, a primitive alarm triggered by a yucca tripwire, revealing the position of another group. Don Mateo, watching from a distance, cursed as he saw his stealthy approach disintegrate into a chaos of stumbles and curses. In a rage, he yelled, "Burn it all, now!" Obeying the desperate order, a cowboy closer to the target threw his torch. It flew in a hissing orange arc, not at the cabin, but landing in the middle of the Three Sisters' garden. The dry squash leaves caught fire instantly, and the flames licked the cornstalks with a crackling hunger, illuminating the scene with a sinister dancing light. The sanctuary was on fire. The fire, instead of creating panic, ignited a cold fury in Tahay. Those flames weren't just consuming his harvest. They were devouring months of hope, Elias's first smile, the redemption he had found in the land. Moving like a phantom through the smoke that was already beginning to choke the air, he ran not to shelter, but to the source of life, the well. With quick, economical movements, he dipped a leather bucket and ran into the heart of the inferno. The water hit the flames with a furious hiss, turning fire into steam and darkness. One of the cowboys, drawn by the movement, advanced with a machete, his face illuminated by the crackling light. Tahay dropped the empty bucket and, in a fluid motion, grabbed the hoe. When the man attacked, he didn't block, but pivoted, using the hoe's handle to deflect the blade and, in the same motion, strike the attacker in the solar plexus, robbing him of his breath and his will to fight. From the rocks above, Elias watched, not with terror, but with the focus of a hunter. He understood that the enemy's greatest weapon was not the machete, but the fire. He didn't aim at the men, but at the light they carried. A fist-sized stone, thrown with surprising accuracy, struck. Another cowboy's torch, which fell into the dust and went out. A second throw and another torch flew away. The sudden darkness was a worse enemy than the Apache. The men, now disoriented and stumbling on the uneven terrain, yelled to each other, their voices filled with an uncertainty bordering on panic. Don Mateo, from his safe position, watched his plan of purification by fire unravel into a confusion of shadows and shouts. The fire that was supposed to expose his enemy now only served to blind his own men, while Tahay, a ghost nourished by the darkness, moved among them. The hunters, now blind and separated, became the hunted. Taking advantage of the curtain of smoke and dancing light, Tahay became a spectre. One of the men, trying to relight the wick of his torch, cursed under his breath. He didn't hear the silent footsteps on the soft earth, nor did he feel the change in the air behind him. Tahay's hand covered his mouth, stifling a scream, while the handle of the hoe pressed. A vital point on his neck. The man collapsed without a sound, a cloth doll whose strings had been cut. Another cowboy, seeing his companion disappear into the shadows, panicked and fired his pistol randomly into the smoke. The flash of the shot illuminated his terrified face for an instant, revealing his position to everyone, especially to Elias, who already had another stone in hand. From a distance, Don Mateo's fury was a silent volcano, watching his men, once so arrogant, being dismantled by the darkness and a single phantom. The blind shot was the crack that broke the backbone of the attacker's courage. Before Elias could throw his stone, a new terror emerged from the darkness. With a wild neigh that seemed to tear the very fabric of the night, Kia burst from the damaged corral area, a mass of muscle and fury galloping through the smoke. To the already terrified men, it wasn't a horse, but a dark beast conjured from hell. It was the last straw. Cries of "Diablo" echoed as the remaining cowboys threw their torches and weapons to the ground and ran haphazardly into the safety of the desert, trampling each other in their haste to escape. The retreat turned into a humiliating rout, leaving Don Mateo virtually alone, abandoned by his men, and consumed by a hatred that had now become personal and absolute. In the middle of his desecrated sanctuary, under a moonless sky, Tahay stood, watching the cowards disappear, the silence filled only by the crackling of the dying fire. In his garden, Don Mateo's hatred was now a living thing, a black beast that fed on his own humiliation. Abandoned by his men, he remained mounted, a statue of fury in the darkness, watching the smoke rise from the small piece of land that had defeated him. The mocking laughter of his cowboys in his memory, the image of the empty revolver being returned to him, the sound of his men's fleeing hooves, it all merged into a single burning resolution. If he couldn't possess that place, he would sterilize it, his eyes fixed not on the cabin, but on the well, the beating heart of that oasis. The water was the source of the savage's power, the soul of his defiance. With a calm that was more frightening than any shout, he dismounted, taking a small leather pouch from his saddle. He wasn't just going to leave, he was going to salt the earth, poison the source, and leave behind nothing but a tomb of dust for the Apache and his boy. There were no words of victory between Tahay and Elias. Soon as the last sound of the escape dissipated, they turned to the enemy that remained, the fire. With a synchronicity born of necessity, they worked, filling buckets and jugs at the well and running to the smoldering garden, smothering the flames with water and earth. Every saved cornstalk, every bean root protected from the heat, was a small victory against the darkness. They moved through the smoke, two shadows determined to save the wounded heart of their world. When the last ember was extinguished with a final hiss, silence fell again, heavy and thick with the smell of smoke and wet earth. It was then, in the stillness, that they heard it. Not the gallop of a retreat, but the slow, deliberate sound of boots on gravel. They both turned, and saw the solitary silhouette of Don Mateo standing at the edge of the well, not as a defeated man, but as an executioner about to deliver the final blow. Don Mateo's gesture was slow, almost ceremonial. With his fingers, he opened the small bag and turned it over the mouth of the well. A fine white powder, which shone like ground salt under the starlight, fell in a continuous stream, dissolving into the dark water. It wasn't a sound, but the sight of that profane act that broke Tahay's paralysis. He didn't let out a war cry, but a guttural roar, the sound of a guardian spirit whose sanctity had been violated. In a blur of silent fury, he crossed the space that separated them, his body low and tense like a cougar about to pounce. Don Mateo barely had time to turn, a smile of malicious triumph freezing on his face as he saw death approaching. The collision was brutal. There was no technique, only the clash of two opposing wills, to destroy and to protect. Mateo, caught by surprise, tried to draw a knife from his belt, but it was too late. The same hands that had dug the earth for life, that had shaped adobe and comforted an orphan boy, closed around Don Mateo's neck with the force of ancient roots. The struggle was short and terrible, a spasm of violence in the heart of the sanctuary. There was an ugly crack, the sound of something breaking. Don Mateo's body went limp, and Tahay released him. The man who considered himself the owner of that desert collapsed like an empty sack, his head hitting the stone edge of the well he had tried to murder before rolling to the side, lifeless in the dust. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the dripping of water from an overturned bucket, falling onto the earth now stained with more than just smoke. The air stood still, heavy with the smell of smoke and the silence of death. Tahay didn't move, his chest heaving not from the effort, but from the weight of what he had just done. Slowly, he looked down at his own hands, the same ones that had found water and raised walls, now stained with the end of a life. He felt no triumph, only a cold emptiness that the poison in the well seemed to echo in his soul. Victory tasted like bitter ash. It was the sound of small, approaching feet that brought him back. Elias stopped beside him, his eyes fixed not on Don Mateo's fallen body, but on Tahay's face. The boy reached out and, with a trust that defied the horror of the scene, touched Tahay's arm. It wasn't a gesture of comfort, but of acknowledgement. That night, the child who had learned to build had also learned the terrible cost of protecting. Without a word, the decision was made. The night was not for mourning or fear, but for erasing the traces of the desecration. With a strength that seemed to come from the earth itself, Tahay lifted Don Mateo's lifeless body and placed it over Kia's saddle. The horse, which had fought by his side, accepted the grim burden without reluctance. Tahay gave the animal's flank a gentle slap and whispered a command into the wind. Kia set off at a slow, ghostly trot towards its former master's ranch, a silent messenger carrying the price of arrogance. When the horse's silhouette disappeared into the darkness, Tahay turned back. The body was gone, but the wound remained. He knelt at the edge of the well, looking into the dark and now useless water, the heart of his miracle transformed into a liquid tomb. The battle against the men was over, but the real war, the war against the poison Mateo had left behind, was just beginning. The dawn arrived not as a promise, but as a witness, casting a grey light on the devastation. The smell of smoke and death hung heavy in the air. Tahay did not allow himself to grieve. With a stiff movement, he picked up the leather bucket and walked to the desecrated well. Without hesitation, he plunged it into the poisoned water and lifted it, pouring the contents onto the scorched earth beside the garden. The sound of the water hitting the ground was a sound of waste, of life being discarded. Elias, seeing his protector's action, grabbed a smaller jug and imitated him. Together, in the silence of the cold morning, they began the Herculean and desolate task of emptying the heart of their world, bucket by bucket, in a ritual of purification born from despair. Each drop spilled a testament to the cruelty they had faced and the price of their survival. As they worked, their backs aching and muscles protesting, Tahay looked to the horizon, where Kia had disappeared. He knew that the arrival of the riderless horse at Don Mateo's ranch would be a more powerful message than any words. The whisper of the miracle in the desert would die that morning, and in its place, a darker, more fearsome legend would be born, that of the Apache spirit who could not be bought, driven out, or killed. He looked at Elias, whose small hands were red from the effort, but whose gaze was steady. The boy was no longer an orphan he protected. He was the only other citizen of his two-man nation, the heir to a piece of land bought with blood. Emptying the well was just the beginning. Clean water, he knew, would have to be found deeper, not just in the earth, but in the soul, to wash away not only Mateo's poison, but the mark that night had left on them both forever. Days merged into a cycle of exhaustion and determination. Under the scorching sun that punished their backs, Tahay and Elias worked tirelessly, emptying the soul of their home. There were no words, only the shared rhythm of the bucket dipping, being lifted and poured, and the hollow sound of water hitting the dry earth. With each trip, the water level dropped, revealing the stone walls Tahay had lined, now stained by the poison. It was a work of mourning, a penance, and a promise. Until finally the bucket scraped the bottom, bringing up not water, but a dark, thick mud. They stopped, covered in sweat and mud, and looked at the empty hole that had once been a miracle. They felt no relief, only the deep emptiness of a completed sacrifice. The well was dead, but the surrounding land, soaked with the poisoned water, was beginning to die too. While they waged their silent battle, the dark legend Tahay had foreseen took shape. Kia had arrived at Don Mateo's ranch like a phantom herald, his master's body lifeless on the saddle. Panic and confusion gave way to a superstitious fear that spread through the desert like wildfire. The story of the Apache who made the desert bloom was replaced by that of the spirit who commanded the land and could not be killed. Cowboys who once cut through those lands now made long detours, crossing themselves as they passed. Small offerings began to appear on the border of his territory, a bag of grain, a piece of colored cloth, a small talisman, left not by friends, but by terrified men seeking to appease what they did not understand. Tahay and Elias touched nothing. They had become untouchable, protected not by walls, but by a rampart of fear. The cabin was no longer an oasis, but an island, and they, its sole and lonely guardians. This protection, born of fear, is the loneliest of victories. Leave a comment to let Tahay and Elias know they are not alone, and subscribe so you don't miss any more videos. Thank you for watching.